Hello, my name's Dave Millard from the University of Southampton in the UK, and I'm here with Ben Clothier to talk about our paper, Awash, Prospective Story Sifting Intervention. I'm going to start off the presentation by saying a bit about emergent narrative and how it differs from design narrative, and then I'll hand over to Ben to explain about the game, our architecture, and to discuss some of our preliminary results. Let's begin by talking about emergent narratives and what makes them a bit different. So when we talk about IDN, we might more typically be talking about a design narrative. So that's where an author has sat down, written a story, which is then experienced by a reader or a player. In a generative narrative, it's a very similar approach, but here the human being is replaced by an algorithm or a machine author. They produce the story that's then experienced by the player. One of the crucial differences here is that as the player interacts with the story, the machine is there and can respond, so you have a sort of a feedback cycle that can change the story as the player interacts with it. One of the benefits of designed or generative narrative is that you can aim for narrative completeness. This is the idea of a narrative that is consistent, efficient, meaning it doesn't have any extra bits in it that don't add towards the narrative goal, and it has a suitable pacing with appropriate dramatic highs and lows. In emergent narratives, things are a bit different. Here we don't have an author at all, but instead the player interacts directly with the story world. Through these interactions and a process called narrative sense-making, they see stories emerge in the world around them. They then react to those things, which in turn creates more stories that they can sense. Emergent narrative have a completely different set of aesthetics. So I won't go through them all here, but Ryan identifies 10 of them. For example, the fact that the narrative you're experiencing is personal, that you discover it yourself, that the possibilities are vast, and that there's a feeling of co-authoring the story with the world rather than being served up something on a plate. On the other hand, it's very hard to get the sort of narrative completeness we were talking about previously. Emergent narrative stories aren't as efficient, they don't necessarily have the right pacing, and there isn't a consistency of story in the experience. The holy grail of emergent narrative would be to have narrative completeness, but to preserve these 10 aesthetics. In our work, we look to achieve this through story sifting. So when people talk about story sifting, typically they're talking about retrospective sifting, which is something that can be achieved through sifting patterns. In retrospective sifting, you take all of the things that happen in an emergent narrative, all of the actions and activities and events over time, and then you take a set of sifting patterns, things that describe interesting events or interesting story combinations, and you look for those patterns in the events. You then draw attention to them, effectively telling the player or the reader that these are the bits of the story that will be interesting to them. Retrospective sifting is something you do after the fact. So in other words, all the events have had to be generated before you can go about doing it. Now that won't work for something like a narrative game where you have to spot things as they occur. Instead, you need to take an approach of prospective sifting. An example of this was put forward by Kreminsky. Incremental sifting uses sifting patterns, but here you take events as they arise and you look for emerging patterns. In other words, you look for the first couple of events in the pattern and draw attention to those as they occur. Our approach builds on this idea. You take the incremental sifter and you add a drama manager. So here you take events as they arise, you look for emerging patterns, but rather than just drawing attention to them, you pass that to a drama manager that then intervenes in the simulation in order to make those patterns more likely to complete. The idea is to increase the likelihood of achieving narrative completeness. That's what the drama manager is trying to achieve. But at the same time, because you're using the natural events as they occur in the world, we're hoping to preserve the emergent narrative aesthetics. I'm now going to hand over to Ben, who's going to say a little bit more about our implementation and our initial results.
Hi there, I'm Ben Clothier, a recent graduate of the University of Southampton, and I'm going to take you through the game I made and the results of its evaluation. So, what is Awash? Awash is a simple pirate-themed game prototype that I made to implement and evaluate this intervention technique. You captain a ship and can explore the tile-based map to interact with other ships, settlements, and sharks, as well as find the ancient artifact and plunder trade ships. So how is it made? Well, first we begin with the fundamental component of the game, the story world. This is simply the state of the game world at any given time, consisting of entities such as captains and ships. This component is not active by itself and must be driven by agents that control characters within it. For the player character, this is done through the GUI, where possible actions are displayed and then chosen from by the player. This is then enacted on the player character, which updates the state of the world and then logs an event to the event stream. The event stream is simply a single point in the system where every action taken by a character is logged. We'll come back to that later. Each non-player character is controlled similarly by an AI agent. This is essentially the same process but without the need for a graphical interface. These agents choose actions according to a random distribution over all the possible actions, and that's designed to make sensible decisions and allow them to survive within the game. And with that, we have a fully functioning emergent narrative game. But due to the narrative paradox, interesting sequences don't emerge as often as we'd like. So in comes the dramatic system to attempt to remedy this. The first component we will look at here is the narrative appraiser component. This uses story sifting to look for dramatic sequences emerging within our simulation, and this functions using sifting patterns. A sifting pattern is a generic representation of a set of interesting event sequences. Here we see a sifting pattern template. It consists of an ordered sequence of event queries, each of which generically describes a set of criteria that an event must meet to be considered a match. Next, a set of invalidation event queries. If any of these are matched, the pattern is invalidated and discarded. And finally, entity variables, which allow specific entities in the game to be referenced in the criteria of future events. When an event occurs that matches the first query of a sifting pattern template, a partial match is created from it, leaving the template unaltered. What is a partial match? Well, it is a representation of a sifting pattern that has at least one of its events already matched. If we think of a pattern template as an unchangeable schematic of a pattern, then a partial match is an actively changing copy of it. While playing the game, each partial match monitors the event stream for potential matches to its next query. When a matching event occurs, it advances the pattern. A non-matching event is ignored, and an event matching an invalidation will discard the pattern. So let's see this within the narrative appraiser. An event is received from the event stream. Any matching templates create a new partial match and add it to the partial match pool. The same event is passed to all the existing partial matches, and each try to match that event with its next query or any of its invalidations. And that's it. The pool of partial matches now contains information about dramatic sequences that are currently taking place and the possible futures that would complete those sequences. This is the information we use to inform the intervention of our drama manager. So let's talk about intervention. We considered 3 levels of intervention. First is generative intervention, the strongest of them, choosing events to enact and creating situations within the game. For example, if your player needs to be put in danger, you just spawn a ship to fight them. Weaker than this is direct intervention, where we directly choose between existing event possibilities to enact. If your player needs to be put in danger, next time they come across a ship, make that ship attack them. And finally, the weakest, indirect intervention. Here we add bias to existing event possibilities to make certain types of events more likely to be enacted. If your player needs to be put in danger, next time they come across a ship, encourage it to act aggressively towards them, i.e., we add a bias to actions that would be considered aggressive. This method was chosen since it's the least forceful and the most likely to preserve the aesthetics, and we call our implementation of these biases stage directions. This was implemented as simply as possible by tagging certain moments within sifting patterns with what we call influence triggers. When a partial match reaches this point, it sends the trigger to the drama manager. The trigger is then looked up in a table to retrieve the stage directions, as well as narrations. The stage directions are given to the appropriate AI agent to manipulate its random choices, and the narration is displayed to the player via the GUI to aid with narrative sense-making. And we're done. Now we have a feedback loop that theoretically encourages more dramatic sequences to occur. So, does this succeed? I'll briefly outline our experiment and its results now, but if you want to see this in full, I recommend checking out the paper. Bringing it back to the start for a second, what we want to know is, can our intervention improve the narrative completeness of our game, and can it do this without compromising the aesthetics of emergent narrative? To find this out, we did a qualitative analysis of two game modes, one with the intervention, the stage directions, and one without them. This involved 12 university students, each of which played the game for 20 minutes in each mode. The order of the modes was alternated between them, and they were briefed on how to play, but did not know what mode they were playing or what the modes were. They were then interviewed for another 20 minutes to break down the experiences they had in their playthroughs. And here are the results. From the interviews, we inductively identified 3 themes with 10 sub-themes. The first 2 indicate the presence of the aesthetics in each mode, and the last gives us a sense of the narrative completeness. We believe these results indicate that we are increasing the narrative completeness and are still seeing the desired aesthetics, and therefore also that these 2 goals are not necessarily in conflict. There are of course limitations. Firstly, this was a relatively small experiment. Ideally, a more complete analysis would be undertaken. Secondly, they are limited to our game. It would be interesting to see our method analysed in more complex games and different genres. And finally, I wanted to point out that our implementation is not the definitive way to do this, and that it would be beneficial to analyse different intervention methods in the same way. And to finish off, I wanted to leave you with a few things to take away. So this work demonstrates a novel combination of a story sifter and a drama manager that we call Prospective Story Sifting Intervention. And this intends to do 2 things. Firstly, it intends to open the door to exploring further intervention strategies aimed at creating more complete narrative experiences that remain strongly emergent in their aesthetic. And finally, it intends to encourage the creation of new narrative games that sit between the emergentist and interventionist approaches, benefiting from both. Thank you for coming along to our presentation. If there are any questions, we'd be happy to take them now.